Some critics of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints claim the Church teaches that not only Jesus was married but that he had more than one wife and even children. Such claims are false. The Church has never taken an official position on Jesus being married, let alone having children. It has never been a doctrine of the Church, as you can see in this statement from Dale Bills in the Deseret News. Members are allowed to decide for themselves on the subject and all positions are acceptable. Some members believe Jesus was not married. Some members believe Jesus was married. Some may even believe Jesus had more than one wife. Many probably have made no conclusion on the issue. It is true a few 19th century church leaders believed that Jesus not only was married but had more than one wife and even children. Brigham Young and Orson Pratt held this view. Jedediah M. Grant also held this view. Why they held these views I am not sure. Perhaps they held a bias living during a time polygamy was practiced in the church and assumed that Jesus practiced it as well. What is important is that their views are unusual. The fact that they have to find a few 19th century examples and not 20th and 21st century show these views are outliers and not the mainstream view of the church. No indication that Joseph Smith held to this view that I know of. When it comes to the issue of Jesus being married at all, the evidence is thin to decide either way. The New Testament leaves the issue open. One can say that Jesus was not married with the rationale that if he was married, the writers would have mentioned it. This is a valid position to hold. A person could legitimately hold the view that Jesus was married without seeing a problem with the New Testament not mentioning Jesus was married. They could argue that in the Scriptures, women and their roles tend to be limited and live more in the shadows. The wives of prophets are often overlooked. In the case of Jesus, only two get much attention, and that is his mother and Mary Magdalene. Pretty much everyone else comes and goes. It could be the writers of the New Testament were consistent and ignored the wife of Jesus just as they ignored the wives of other disciples or apostles. A person could argue that Jesus was married by the fact that marriage was a normal part of the Jewish culture, so it was viewed as a given that he was married, thus not requiring it to be mentioned. An unmarried Jesus would have been stood out more and more likely, causing someone to mention that he was not married. William Phipp argues in The Sexuality of Jesus. Even if there were no reference in the Gospels to Jesus' circumcision, it would be wrong to conclude that his father neglected or rejected that duty. Just as the Quran does not mention circumcision and takes the obligation of marriage for granted, so the Gospels do not mention the circumcision or marriage of most of the men who are discussed in it. This is due to the fact that those social institutions were practiced in a thoroughgoing manner in the Semitic culture. Deviations from normative behavior are more likely to be remembered and thus lodged in oral and written traditions, so it makes sense to assume that Jesus and his apostles were all circumcised and married. The following Jewish site says, marriage is vitally important in Judaism. Refraining from marriage is not considered holy, as it is in some other religions. On the contrary, it is considered unnatural. The Talmud says that an unmarried man is constantly thinking of sin. The Talmud tells of a rabbi who was introduced to a young unmarried rabbi. The older rabbi told the younger one not to come into his presence again until he was married. The minimum age for marriage under Jewish law is 13 for boys, 12 for girls. However, the kiddushin can take place before that, and often did in medieval times. The Talmud recommends that a man marry at age 18, or somewhere between 16 and 24. The New Testament is not a biography on the life of Jesus. Most of his life is ignored. There is some information about his birth, when he was about 12 years old, and then his baptism about age 30. The massive 18-year gap between 12 and 30 is substantial. He could have married in his 20s. Based on statistical probability, it is more likely Jesus had a wife than not. Say if 75% of adult Jewish men in a population had a wife, then there is a 75% chance of picking any random man in that population as a married man. This does not prove Jesus was married, but all other considerations being equal, it is more likely he was married than he was not based on probability. Much has been made about the possibility that Mary Magdalene being the wife of Jesus. Some interesting things in the New Testament and early Christian documents could lead one to believe that. Though interesting, I don't personally find enough evidence in them to prove it. I believe that if Jesus did have a wife, Mary Magdalene does seem to make the most sense. It would explain she seems to play a more important role in the life of Jesus during his ministry than Jesus' own mother. As a member of the church, I tend to lean towards Jesus was married and Mary Magdalene was his wife, but that is just a leaning. I am not firm on that position. As a side note, There is an idea out there that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. Nowhere in scriptures is she identified as such. That idea originated from Pope Gregory I in 604 AD. I think is wise not to label Mary as prostitute when there is no reason to suggest she ever was one. Regardless, no official position in the Church is made and members like me are free to choose for ourselves on the issue without consequence. Anyone who claims the Church teaches Jesus was married or had more than one wife is not being honest. Thank you for your time.